Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be with you all today. Before we dive into this discussion, I want to start with the land acknowledgement, recognizing the tribes that inhabited the land that I currently live on. An acknowledgement of traditional land is really just a public statement naming the native inhabitants of a place and honors their historic relationship with the land. Some of you may have researched and know that the land that you're on. We'll be putting a link in the chat for you to use to identify the land in case you're not aware. I encourage you to put your name in the chat, where you are from, and the lands that you currently inhabit. And land acknowledgement is really just a first step, and it's an invitation to deeper learning, relationships, and actions. And just really consider, particularly for those that are working in community and with community, to encourage some and consider some concrete steps of how you can support and partner with Indigenous communities in the future. And my place of residence is Olympia, Washington, and I am on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Nisqually, the Coast Salish, the Cowlitz, and the Chehalis Nation, Let us acknowledge the painful history of forced removal from this territory and pay respect to the diverse Indigenous people still connected to this land. And let us just give thanks to all the tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. Thank you. So the Population Health Innovation Lab is a program of the Public Health Institute, and our focus is on the success of health-focused multi-sector collaboratives. And in particular, we've hung out a lot with accountable communities of and for health. And as you can see from this slide, we offer a variety of services to support your success. And we are particularly interested in research to practice and increasing those that we're working with to work in complexity through the use of tools and frameworks. So today we're excited because this is one particular, actually you're going to hear about 3 tools that could be really useful in your work. So let's see, next slide. So our objectives today are to understand how technology and tools can enhance relationships and multi-sector collaboratives. We're going to provide an overview. Actually, Jeff is going to be providing an overview of the Kumu suite of network mapping and collaboration tools. And we're going to learn how to organize complex data into relationship maps and tell compelling stories about your communities, with your communities. So with that, we are so fortunate and grateful to be partnering with Kumu, and they have generously offered us to offer to you a 20% discount. We also offer technical assistance in this tool, but also many others. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. And I think we're going to be putting in the chat how you can actually access both Jeff afterwards if you have some questions, as well as getting that discount. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Very excited. I believe Jeff is in Berkeley. I'm not sure if he's in Berkeley or Hawaii. I know he was pondering a trip over, but he is the co-founder and CEO of Kumu, which is a company that's dedicated to building tools to tackle tough problems. His background spans diverse sectors and areas of focus, where he usually sits at the intersection of systems, networks, and strategy. He also serves as the strategy and governance advisor for the Amidiart Group and is a director on the boards of Humanity United, Jounce Partners, and the Academy for Systems Change. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jeff.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sue. And great to be here with all of you. Let me get my screen shared because we'll walk through both a bit of an overview about kind of Kumu, our company, and the suite of products, and then be able to dive directly into each of those tools. And the goal for today is really to both give you an overview so you understand all those different tools, what's kind of possible with each, and get a little bit more of a bearing on which of those tools might be relevant for the particular challenges that you're facing. And then we'll spend a little bit of a deeper dive on 2 of them in particular, trying to give you some first steps to make sure you feel like you can get started using these tools in ways that may be practical for your particular networks and collaboratives. So a bit of background about Kumu. It was founded by me and my brother back in 2011. And we were both kind of working on different projects where we were kind of seeing the challenges of both better understanding relationships in terms of among people. So really looking at social networks, understanding how influence might allow certain policies to be passed, and also really wrestling with complex challenges and looking to try to understand and better visualize why certain problems were so hard to change. And we had set off to actually try to find existing tools to use in that work, and really didn't find much that were all that easy to use. And so for us, we ended up partnering and actually trying to build a company around how can we build some tools that allow this sort of power to be able to visualize relationships, better understand complex challenges and complex systems, but make those easy to use and hopefully a little bit more engaging and maybe even beautiful, because one of the challenges, right, is this can quickly become overly complex, but instead, how can you really help people walk into and better understand some of these challenges in a way that you can then do really effective storytelling with others and bring people along in that journey. If you've ever listened to Gene Bellinger, and I think he's joined on this call as well, one of the things he loves to talk about in terms of what the essence of systems thinking is really understanding relationships and their implications. And so in many ways, that's what a lot of the different platforms that Kumu operates allows you to do. It may allow you to visualize those relationships, see them a little bit differently, be able to build out those relationships collaboratively with others, but really trying to get people to this sense of, and what's the so what, right? Once we do that, is there a storytelling lens that allows us to bring awareness in from others that we didn't have before? And when we think about Kumu, Kumu is the initial flagship product that we built. And the tagline for that is, make sense of your messy world. And so that was the first product that we built. That's a much more flexible and multi-purpose tool. So people use that in a number of different ways. They'll use it to visualize networks. So really trying to look at how people are connected across an organization, across a collaborative, where they're actually visualizing people as kind of circles on the map. And then the connections out to other people is a strength of relationship. It might be a collaboration, it might be a personal relationship, but really trying to visualize and be able to analyze those networks and figure out how to make those stronger. And so another use case is also doing systems mapping. So the way to think about a systems map is it's also trying to understand relationships and the implications, but often it's looking more at cause and effect. So in something like early childhood development, what are all the different factors at play and how do they relate together to either allow us to move towards better outcomes for kids, or what's preventing us to move towards better outcomes for kids? And so think of Kumu as really flexible, really multi-purpose. It often is something where people will either input data on their own or they'll import from a spreadsheet. So if you already have a list of everyone who's in your collaborative, right, Kumu is a quick tool to be able to import that and then quickly visualize and start to see what some of those connections are. Early on, when the pandemic hit, we sat as a team and started thinking about what has changed in this context and what can we introduce that would help support people along the line of the mission of our organization. And that's where Sticky Studio, which is the column on the left, came in. And the way to think about Sticky Studio is if you've ever used another collaborative whiteboard tool like Mural or Miro or even Jamboard, it's similar to that functionality in that as you move things around on the page and as other people are adding, you can see all of that in real time. So it's a way to have that collaborative work together in the same space feeling while continuing to emphasize relationships. So we try to make it really easy to draw those connections and encourage people to do that. But this is more for that early, messy, generative time for your network or community. Maybe you're brainstorming an initial set of stakeholders and stakeholder groups and starting to think about how they might connect, or you're doing some of the early kind of causal fragments of trying to understand a complex system. Sticky Studio is a great place to start, and we'll dive in and show you a little bit more there. The last one I'll talk about today is Weavr. And so that's that column on the far right. And Weavr really for us is more of an online community platform. Again, trying to focus on understanding relationships within that community. So oftentimes the types of communities who use Weavr are what I would call impact-oriented networks or communities. So they're coming together around some common goal or vision, usually for a complex system, oftentimes some of these same networks would consider them to be collective impact initiatives. But what that platform allows you to do is invite everyone into a closed social network space where that community owns the data, but each person can control their own profile, update that profile, and can easily list who else they're connected to within that network. So then everyone can have this view of what is the structure of the network, who's more central, who's less central, how might I turn to others in the network for things like advice and expertise, but can we really try to harness the true underlying human capital that exists in so many of these communities that oftentimes just goes missed, right? There's so many times that interesting work ends up happening that everyone's not aware of. So we recreate the wheel, or you don't realize that someone has expertise in a certain area or is connected to a certain organization. And so we miss out on that value. And so Weavr is really built to help try to solve that specific challenge. So we'll walk through each of those. We're going to spend more time on Kumu and Sticky Studio, but make sure we at least touch a bit on all three in case you feel like one in particular is the one that feels right for the type of work that you're doing. And again, if we finish and we haven't been able to go as deep as you want, you have the contact information for me and our team as well. So feel free to reach out. And again, if questions come up as we go through this session, feel free, just drop them in the chat and the team will be looking at those and interrupting where it makes sense to try to make sure that we can address any questions that you have. But what we'll do, we'll dive first into Kumu, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time on Sticky Studio. We'll do a really quick touch on Weavr, and then we're going to circle back and do an even deeper dive on Kumu because it's the one that has a little bit of a longer learning curve. So let me switch, and what I'll do is start to show a couple different use cases for Kumu. And before we dive into this specific use case, I want to do just a little orientation to kind of the tool itself and what you see and what some of the language is that we use, just to make sure that no one's getting tripped up on that. So what you're looking at is what we call a project in Kumu. This one was a project that was done around mapping stakeholders in the birth through age 8 continuum. It was done by the Institute of Medicine. And then if you zoom in, you'll see each of these circles are individual stakeholder groups. And in Kumu, we call those elements. So if you hear me refer to them as that, just think of it as one of the circles on the maps. And then these lines are either relationships, or formally in Kumu, we call them connections, but any of the elements can be connected together. And then we also have this ability to do loops, which you'll see later on in an example of systems map. But the primary terminology to remember is elements and connections. This sidebar can open, and if you don't click on anything, this will actually give you an overview, or gives you the opportunity to provide an overview of the map. And so in this case, they're using this area to give a bit of a context to why this map, what is it trying to detail. And then if I click on any of these circles, this left side changes, and this shows what we call the profile. Same thing, if I click on a connection, this will change. Not all of them have information there, but that's one of the things to remember about Kumu, and what's also unique between Kumu and, say, Sticky Studio, is you can add a lot of depth and context to this left side profile to be able to bring more information, right? It might be, if you're mapping stakeholders, it might be information about where they're located, what skills they bring, what sector they're from. We have a lot of flexibility in here about bringing a more data-driven approach to the networks and systems that you're trying to analyze. And you'll see some more examples of that as we continue through the tool. Up here, you'll see this is the name of the project. We have the option to switch between different maps. So just think of those as different kind of buckets of data within a project, and also to switch between different views. And think of views as just easy ways to change the decorations and coloring and filtering that's done on top of a data set. So for example, maybe this is coloring by region of the map, but instead we wanted to shift to highlighting those stakeholders which were maybe more or less influential or more or less involved in the process to date. Those are all things that we might use a different view to bring to life. And again, for them, when they created this, part of this intent, this is a very very zoomed out view, but what they wanted to do is to think about kind of each stakeholder group and the general category that they're in. What at a high level are the categories that are interacting together, right? So in this case, things like professional roles in social services, professional roles in care and education, they're seeing some collaboration happening across those stakeholder groups within it. And if I zoom in, you'll see there are things like social service agency leadership, caseworker from child welfare system. So it's there's still a stakeholder group level. It's not individual stakeholders, but really trying to give this overall view. And one of the ways that this was used was as a template in different contexts for people to look at and think about, do we have representation across many of the different settings and stakeholder groups that we might want to when we think about a big, complex kind of systems change initiative touching something as large as kind of the birth through age 8 continuum. An example of where you could actually take this and go much more detailed would be if we come up here and switch into this education and care sector detail map. So this is basically one where they've zoomed in and said, for that specific sector, what are the relationships? So if I hover on, say, Head Start program, what we're doing is Kumu is now highlighting just those things that are directly connected to Head Start. And so we can see the connections out to these other elements. And if you look in the lower left corner, there's a little legend. And basically the gold lines mean organizational leadership. The gray solid line means frequent interaction with children. And then the dotted gray line means occasional interaction. So they've basically added some additional data about the strength of those connections here, when it says organizational leadership, or for example, here where it says occasional. So they're actually saving that to that profile and then being able to bring that to life using this map. So quick example of how you might use this more for this identification of an ecosystem of stakeholder groups and how there may or may not be connections and collaborations generally across those groups. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and show you an example. I know not all of you are necessarily doing systems mapping, but just wanted to show an example of how these are done and reflected in Kumu in case that's an interest. So here, again, similar look and feel, right? It looks a little bit different, but we still have the circles and the lines. And then in this case, what this is trying to do is basically reflect what are some of those, what are the connections among the cause and effect factors? And can we try to get to articulate what are called loops? So for example, if I hover on this deep structure, this is basically what they have identified as the deep structure for this specific system. And so I believe this map was around some of the challenges in public health and really thinking about what right now is leading to kind of public health being able to play the aspirational role that it hopes it could play. And so in this case, what they're basically saying is there's this loop that includes things like level of trust and engagement, access to needed resources, workforce capacity and impact. And so the goal with these loops is to really try to articulate what are some of the underlying patterns which are at play, which either make us move towards the ideal kind of state of the system that we want to try to move towards, or that might be keeping us from moving there. And the goal is to be able to tell this in such a way that we can bring people along, help them be able to ask questions, interrogate, improve on that thinking, and hopefully move towards a different understanding that allows us to unlock some of where there may be challenge, whether that's because people didn't see the challenge in a certain way, or there was underinvestment in a certain area, or it's changing the strategies that people use. But a lot of times people will be using Kumu specifically to try to create systems maps like this. Here's another example. Again, you'll see people use color within this. And so color ends up being things like the region of the map. We have a deep structure. We have the blue color, which is health and social impacts, the purple color, which represents policy and regulation. And again, if I click here, you'll see that comes up. There's this policy tag that someone has saved. And that's kind of what Kumu is using to basically say, anytime something has the policy tag, color it purple. So there's a lot of flexibility about how you can create these visuals, add some information here on this profile, and then be able to bring that information to life using some rules that you can then set up within Kumu. We'll switch gears and move a little bit more towards when we think about mapping people and collaboratives, there's a lot of work that's also done on Kumu, really trying to understand what's the shape of the network. So when you think about people coming together around a given initiative, one way we think about it is just who's involved, right? And oftentimes when we look at things like diversity, oftentimes we're looking at that from an overall membership level of a particular community. What's neat is once you start being able to track things like what are the relationships within this community, you get to a much more nuanced understanding of how well you're doing, right? So one interpretation for a map like this could be, hey, we're like, in terms of membership, we've done relatively well in having diversity across the demographics that we're trying to be intentional about. And then when you map it, maybe all of those folks that you thought were balanced are on the periphery, and you have a pretty homogeneous core of the network. Right? Until you've actually done some of that relationship mapping work, you might not be able to get to some of those insights. People will also use this just to think about, hey, what else can we do? How can we recreate connections? Where are there silos that we don't want to have? What might we do to be able to have people be more intentional about using their own relationships to try to introduce people who might not know each other yet? A quick example of this is what's called closing triangles. And if you've ever followed any of June Hawley's work, it's really common, but in this example, right, Aubrey is connected to these two people who aren't connected yet. And so that's a really simple thing for Aubrey to do, is to find herself on this map and think about who else can I connect to create more of these relations across this map and hopefully move towards a healthier overall community in general. So let me zoom back out. Again, when you think about this, the elements here are people, right? So each circle is a person, and then the lines are information that was collected through survey. So basically each line is a relationship between two people, and it can have a strength of 1, 2, or 3. So basically, is it how weak or how strong is that connection? And that's pretty common when people do these sorts of maps, is to have some type of categorization of strength, either by like 1, 2, or 3, or different types of ways that two individuals might be able to interact together. And you'll see in this case, color is represented for sector here. And one of the things you can do in Kumu is add what we call controls to try to make these sorts of maps easier for people to work with, even if they don't know the ins and outs of Kumu. So if I want to, I can click up here, and this gives me controls to then highlight just those people who are in the consulting sector, or for example, just those people who are in the nonprofit or NGO sector. And so those can be built on the fly with Kumu to try to make sure you have just the sort of interaction that you want with a map like this, to make sure it's easy for people to interact and engage without feeling like you need to teach everyone all the ins and outs of Kumu for them to really be able to use and look at that map. One last example here, and then we'll move to a final piece that I'll ask Stephanie to speak to a bit. This is a good example of one of the ways that many people get started. So what this map is, right, it just looks like a bunch of gray circles without much other context, but each of these gray circles is a person. And what's been done here is they've imported through a spreadsheet a lot of information about each person. So we have a bit of a bio. We know what collective impact initiatives they're engaged with. We know what their geographic focus is, issue and outcome area focus. We know what organization they're from, what sector they're involved in. And so what's neat about Kumu is we can pull this information in, and initially there's no explicit relationship information. There's no definition of like Jeff and Sue know each other and there's this strength 3 relationship. But what we can do is we can activate something called clustering, which allows us to take the information that's here in this profile and actually draw connections based on that. So I'm going to click project in just a second, and that's going to draw connections based on anything that's in this collective impact-ish initiative field. Let me find one for you. Here we go. So in this case, right, this will draw a connection from Nadine to the Family Leadership Training Institute. So let me click this and you'll see it change. So now we're actually seeing those projects represented on the map, and we can quickly start to get a view at, wow, interesting. There's a couple people who are playing a pretty central role across a number of different projects here, others who are maybe more involved just among the periphery, but it's a quick way to start understanding what's some of the relational aspects of this profile data that might tell us a little bit more about that community, either maybe who's in a really core influential spot, or who might we need to do a better job of making sure they get connected to an initiative that they care about. Similarly, we can do this with things like geography. and even bring in organization. We can bring in multiple things at the same time, just to be able to start to see what are some of those overlaps and what do they tell us, right? Some of them might not tell us a lot. Some of them might be really helpful, but how can a platform like Kumu help you do a little bit more of that sense making that can support whatever your aspirations are for your given collaborative? So I'm going to switch gears. And so this is another example of an actual analysis that was done on Kumu, specifically with another ACH network. And again, when you look at these, if I zoom in, it's a little bit smaller, but remember, each of these squares actually still represent elements. And in this case, right, these can be tribes or organizations or counties. And so I'll let Stephanie talk a little bit more about how this map was used and what the kind of so what was behind it.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boltema. I am the Director of Research and Network Science with the Population Health Innovation Lab, or PHIL. And this map that you're looking at is a little bit different than all of the other things that Jeff has shown so far, because it is bringing together 7 different ACH networks. This map is really used to test a hypothesis. And so I'll get to that hypothesis in just a moment, but I want to provide a little bit of background. The first is that in PHIL, we do all sorts of network studies, network analysis, network visualization. And I just want to say that with all of the different tools that we use and approaches that we use, Kumu is our favorite for visualizing network data in an interactive and easy to share way. And so when we need to put network maps into a fashion and then share out with people outside of our organization, Kumu is what we usually go to. What you're looking at here is based on a larger research project that we have been working on for the last couple of years. And here you see 7 different ACH networks brought together into one. In case you're not familiar with this term, ACH, this is an accountable community of health. These are community-based multi-sector collaboratives that they exist all over the nation, but right now we're just looking in Washington state. And so when I say ACH, these are just these multi-sector networks. It's a really cool model. If you're not familiar with them, please check them out. But what you're looking at here is that we worked with these 7 ACHs to map their networks of partners, whether that be counties, organizations, or tribes. And we looked at multiple different relationship types. But after we did that, we thought, well, goodness, isn't it likely that even though we're looking at these 7 discrete networks, that really there is a statewide ACH network that has formed because of implementation of these community-based ACH models. And so this map serves as a way to demonstrate, to test, and then demonstrate that hypothesis. That yes, we have previously looked at these 7 distinct networks for each of these ACHs, but then we pulled in all of that data into Kumu and demonstrated that really what you're looking at here is one big network. And we were able to demonstrate that these 7 distinct ACH networks have, to some extent, started to form a statewide ACH network, which is pretty cool, I think. So a little bit different of a purpose, but I do want to point out just a couple of things that I think are really important that Jeff's touched on. First, to the left, so important to use that narrative space. There are so many different types of networks that you can work with. And a lot of people may not be familiar with what a network is, how to interact with it. And so using that narrative space on the left-hand side, I think is a really valuable aspect of the Kumu platform. Jeff also talked about the legend at the bottom. That is, just one thing I love about this tool is that you can bring in all sorts of information about your elements or your projects. And then you can use that information to play around with what your network map looks like. I used that really pretty minimally in this map, but what you can see down there at the bottom is you can start to see which of the elements connect to which ACH. And you'll see that some connect to multiple, but that starts to bring some sense to what is here a pretty large network. And then the final thing that I really like in Kumu projects is being able to use this function of different views. And so right now, the map that you're seeing is a pretty complex network. It includes all these different types of actors, but it also includes several different types of connections. You're looking at collaboration connections, data exchange connections, and referral connections. But let's say you just care about referrals. And so if you wanted to just zoom in on referrals and see how different organizations, counties, and tribes refer to one another throughout the state, you could look at the referrals view and just check things out there. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be done to pretty this up and make it cool, but for our purposes of testing this hypothesis that a statewide ACH network has in fact developed over the last several years, it has served that purpose beautifully. So thanks, Jeff, for the opportunity to share this example that we and Phil have developed. And of course, as Sue mentioned, if you ever want help thinking through network studies or how these ideas might apply in your own work, please do reach out to us. Back to you, Jeff.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, and you may, if you've been involved with network analysis before, you may be wondering too around things like some of the network analysis metrics. So that is all possible here in the platform. You can come down and click metrics down here and then click social network analysis. And we've tried to make it pretty easy to do this. Again, the social network analysis field has, of course, choose pretty complex terms to describe things. And so it takes a little bit of getting used to, but something like degree is just a simple count of the number of connections. In degrees, the number of incoming connections. Betweenness centrality is a really interesting one because it actually looks at the structure of the network and tries to find out who's on the shortest path between any two other connections with it, or any two other spots within the network. And what's neat about that one is someone who may not have a lot of connections, but is the one person connecting two regions that would otherwise not have a through line, actually can end up scoring really high. So it's a neat way to get at some other insights. But I'd say also a lot of the insight, right? I think I wouldn't undervalue the ability to do the visual pattern recognition, right? That can be a really useful thing that you can get a lot of insight from. And so it's this ability to layer in the social network analysis metrics, do the visualization, and then really make sure you're engaging in conversation around it to understand, okay, here's what some of the potential insights are. Does that resonate with people's experience? What other things might explain that? We're going to leave Kumu now for a second and give you a quick taste of Sticky Studio, and then show you a quick example of Weavr, and then we'll come back to Kumu and actually see how you can import data and what this data looks like before you bring it into Kumu.
Hey, Jeff, before you jump away from Kumu,
Yep.
We have a great question from the audience. Amelia asks, can you crowdsource updates to a network map using Kumu?
Great question. So there's not a way to do that right now directly within the platform, but what people have done, we do have the ability to feed in a network like spreadsheet from Google Sheets. So oftentimes that's what people will do. They'll have a Google Sheet structure that gets set up. They'll either send that link out to everyone and let people add it in that way, or they'll structure like a Google form to feed into that, which takes a little bit more setting up, but is certainly possible. And part of the Weavr solution was, given that a lot of people wanted access to say, hey, I just want someone to be able to edit the profile of a particular element in a map. That's more where the Weavr use case came from. Any other questions right now?
Yeah, along those same lines, we have a question, which you touched on, Jeff, about importing and exporting data. How easy is it to do, or complex could it be? And can you export the data to count the connections?
Yep. So counting connections, so you can do that as well, just directly within the platform. If I hit A right now on my keyboard, it'll give you a count of everything that's in here. So there's some easy ways to do that within the platform. But yes, also super easy to do exports. So we let people export out to a PDF or an image in case you want to just share that easily. The XLSX file is just a spreadsheet file. Again, when we turn to Kumu, we'll show you an example of exactly what that data format looks like, but really easy. Think of it as basically just a sheet for all your elements. So each row is a person or an organization, and any of the columns are data about those people or orgs. And then you have a separate sheet that tells you the connection. So kind of from and to, so it might be from a person to a project. And then you can have the other columns be data about that particular connection or relationship.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Great. So let me switch to Sticky Studio. And this is just an example that we built out just to highlight a little bit of how you might use Sticky Studio for some of the earlier brainstorms that go on within the platform. Again, we've tried to make Sticky Studio to have a much lower learning curve. So let me just show you quickly what that interaction looks like. Basically, anyone that you send this URL to, they'll have edit access to this board. You would be able to see if I click and drag a sticky, it'll show up on this map, and I can add text. It's very small, but I promise it's actually showing up there. And if 20 other people were in there and we're all adding at the same time, you'll see those stickies showing up and moving around. We also have some of these background elements. So those are things like labels. For example, what you see here, these categories, that's a label that we've dropped in. And you can use the circles and the squares just to provide a bit of scaffolding if you're trying to do more of the brainstorm oriented sessions with a tool like Sticky Studio. We also have images. So oftentimes people will drop an image in as a background image, and they use that as something that they may be doing additional brainstorming on. We've even had people drop in PDFs of systems maps from Kumu and then let people add sticky notes around that map as a way to bring feedback into that process. And then finally, the other piece here is votes. And so with Sticky, one of the focuses for us has been trying to stay relatively close to what's the experience like in the room. And I don't know about you, but I tend to love the very organic feel that happens when you do a brainstorm and then you just give people the colored circle stickers to do their voting. And so within Sticky, we've tried to keep that experience as well. So the voting consists of just dragging and dropping these circles. Wherever you place it, it'll stay there. So if 20 people are in here doing it, you'll quickly get a bit of this messy view of kind of what people see maybe as more pressing, or maybe your sort is around potential leverage or more important stakeholders. But as you drag and drop these votes, we'll also be able to then count that in the background and give you this kind of summarized view while allowing you to have more of that organic nature of that voting as well. But basically with Sticky, you're creating some of these structures, you're trying to let people quickly flush out and brainstorm ideas, and we're trying to make it easy to create connections by then hovering here and using any of these, what we call connection anchors, to drag and drop to create connections. So maybe you're using this to do a bit of a internal stakeholder brainstorm, and then these are core stakeholder groups and extended stakeholders. And as you're brainstorming, you might realize, oh, wow, some of the internal folks are actually connected to people more on the periphery. And so really trying to make it easy to layer in both this early brainstorm, more generative type of thinking, along with the relational thinking as well. Here's another example over here, right, of doing that more within categories and starting to identify how there might be relationships among categories. Again, this is just a template. There's no text for these, but say this was police here, you'd be able to see that text show up. And if you want, you can actually click on these three dots and open up a profile for that specific sticky. And there's a way to be able to actually have commenting here. We noticed early on as we were doing these sessions, people would end up putting stickies around other stickies to try to have conversation around the content of one particular sticky note. So really trying to encourage people to have that here as a threaded conversation and really try to keep more of that richness of that conversation with the map, so that as other people come in and understand, hey, what do you mean by that sticky, or why did you draw that connection? We have that narrative and that context. Again, once you build this in Kumu, you can export, or build this in Sticky Studio, you can export into Kumu. So once you're done, if at some point you want to go a little bit deeper and build out the profiles more, or have some of the additional flexibility in terms of coloring and shapes and that sort of thing in Kumu, that's possible. You can come here and go to settings and click export, and that'll give you a format that you can take out to another tool. You can also create templates. So if you have a structure that you find yourself using again and again, you can turn it into a template and then easily reuse that, so you're not having to recreate all of the background shapes and labels time and time again. Here's another quick example, right, of more of a built out map using Sticky Studio. And so in this case, this is looking at stakeholders in the traffic citation system, but you can see, right, a little bit more content, connections being drawn. You can do kind of two-way arrows if you need to, but yeah, focus really being on quickly fleshing out these individual factors and the relationships without getting too caught up on some of the UI that might slow you down a little bit in Kumu. And then here's another example of how people are actually using Kumu to do the initial brainstorm on these feedback loops they might see in a system. So if I zoom in here, you'll see each of these different ones are a feedback loop, and they've used this as a way to basically get it all here as like one collaborative workspace, and then exported that into Kumu, and then started to merge those together into one more cohesive overall map in the Kumu platform. But yeah, that's...
We've got a great question from the audience.
Okay.
Can you talk to the similarities or maybe differences from something like Mural?
Yeah, so for us, I'd say because we looked at Mural, for example, it's like, hey, is there really something needed? I'd say the big difference for us was about 3 different areas. So one is the export into Kumu. We found a lot of people were actually building things out in Mural and then wanting to bring it into Kumu, but having to completely recreate it from scratch. And so there's value in trying to minimize that process. The other is in trying to keep more of a focus on usability, of really trying to do the bare minimum that's supported to let people quickly work together on these maps, and then to be able to flush that out. And then the last one is more of just like the different types of interactions we might enable, both through things like commenting and profiles and discussion and some of the voting, but can we create an experience that better supports what for us is not just a real-time process often, but is oftentimes real-time and asynchronous. So you're both working together at the same time, but then fleshing these maps out over time. So how do you come back? How do you keep evolving this work together? How do you see what recent changes are? And we're still working on the features related to that in many ways, but that is a lot of the path that we're heading on right now.
Thanks so much.
So that's sticky. We'll move next into Weavr. And again, the way to think about Weavr is it is a online community platform, right? It's private in that what we're walking through right now, this is a community on Weavr. So don't think of it like a LinkedIn or a Facebook where it's all rolls up into one. Instead, each community is its own database. That community continues to own the data within that community. But what we're trying to do is really have it be a home where we can capture what's really most essential for that community or collaborative. So capture the people, right? Really know who's involved and some important information about the people like interests, skills, whatever those fields are that are most important to you, location, then capture the relationships among those people, right? So that's something that's often missed, but can we make it easier for people to provide on their own how they're connected to other people within that community? Also be able to include the projects that people are working on, and then any orgs or other affiliations that they have. So really try to make it easy in one place to capture this kind of overall ecosystem of who's involved and who's working on what, so that we can benefit from that knowledge and hopefully be able to have more of an impact. So the way that starts, right, I'll show you first what the profile looks like. And again, when you invite someone in, each person has a profile that they can edit. There can be admins as well, which can also come in and be able to edit for other people. But this is my profile. It shows some of my interests. We have offers and needs, which work as paired fields. So we can automatically find when there's an offer that matches with someone else's need, and then do a nudge for those people to get connected. You can see the projects I'm a part of, any organizations I'm affiliated with, and then my relationships categorized by relationship strength. And so if I want to edit this, I can come in here, I can click edit profile, pretty similar experience you would have on another platform, right? Where I can edit each of these, and these are customizable. So you can make them very specific to what's relevant for your community. For editing relationships, I can come here and click this, and this will just take me to a screen where I can either search for people or scroll through a list to indicate who I'm connected to. And then once I click next, it'll circle back and ask me about the relationship strength. These, again, can be customized, so you can make it bespoke to your particular network. And then I can choose whether any other relationships have changed, and then click save. But really our experience has been when people want to collect this information for a particular community or network, it's a big hassle to try to collect it in one go, and an even bigger hassle to try to keep it up to date over time. And so our intention with Weavr is to try to shorten that loop, both keep people in a platform long enough that they're more likely to update their profile and update those relationships over time, but that they can actually keep that up to date and have that spread across the whole group and then be able to get more insights into that community overall.
Jeff, this is wonderful. I know our audience has lots of questions. So if we don't mind, we can bring Stephanie back and we'll open it up for Q&A.
Okay, great.
I see we have a question from Rachel in here. What's the learning curve like for the 3 tools? Jeff, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so I'd say the way to think about it is Kumu has the deeper learning curve, partly because it's the most flexible, right? And so it's not that it's necessarily a super hard tool to use, but it's like where people get tripped up is trying to do too much too early. So there's a lot of different things that you're learning, but like instead really think our push for people in Kumu is to focus first on building out the structure of your map or importing the data and first looking at it there, and then kind of piece by piece going deeper to maybe add color and decorations or do analysis. Sticky Studio is definitely the easiest to use and kind of most feature limited, but still, in our opinion, pretty powerful. And Weavr sits kind of between the two. I'd say the experience for one person in your community using Weavr is meant to be pretty easy and streamlined. And then for an admin, it takes a little bit more work getting set up. But for example, like with Weavr, you can quickly search here. You can search by people, orgs, or projects, do interests and other filters. And then we try to make things like the prompts really easy, right? Where like you come here, you understand there's a big thumbs up and a thumbs down with prompts to connect to other people. So really trying to simplify that as much as possible.
I'd like to say a note about the learning curve on Kumu, which is, so I started learning about network analysis and visualization many years ago. And I started with another tool called Gephi, which is a pretty good tool and like pretty easy to use. But since then, I've been exposed to many others. And Kumu is the easiest by far, in my opinion. And so, and you've since integrated the network analysis functions. And so like if you are seeking to visualize a network and you are seeking to integrate some network analysis in there, of the many different tools that I've experienced and that I regularly play around with, in my personal opinion, learning network analysis, learning network language has a learning curve to it. I think that Kumu makes it extremely accessible and easy. And so it's almost like of all of the different things that are out there, I think that Kumu offers the lowest learning curve for actually entering into starting to visualize your network and even analyze it, especially with you didn't show this, Jeff, but like you can draw your network. You don't even have to import network data. So you have all of these different options even for how you can interact with a tool that I think make the learning curve just really super, and you can kind of adjust it to whatever works for you.
Yeah, and just for example, to demystify the network data side, it's not, it can sound scarier than it is, but the way it looks like here, right? This is an example of spreadsheet for one of the maps you saw. The label column is just the name that you want showing up on the map. And then all of these other fields or whatever is important context for you that you want showing up on that profile. And you can just create these. You don't need to create them beforehand in Kumu. Whatever you add into here, when you import it, it'll automatically get generated in Kumu. And then if you're importing connections, you're doing this from and this to structure. So you just need to give us kind of think of it as both sides of the connection. And then maybe that's all you give, or maybe there's a type, maybe there's a strength. And so it can kind of expand from there. But when you think about network data, it's pretty basic, especially if you come from this idea of like this basic format within a spreadsheet. So many of us, right, for any collaborative we're involved in, we have one of these sheets already, usually floating around somewhere that like someone either is trying to keep up to date or is up to date. And so we try to make that as easy as possible to bring that into Kumu.
And you'll also provide templates, which is super helpful for people as they're learning.
Exactly. Yeah. And that again is part of the trickiness with Kumu on the learning curve is the flexibility, right? So we're basically supporting people to do systems maps and network maps. And you'll see, I think if people noticed, some of the maps float around and move, others don't. And so there's just some additional flexibility that comes, or additional challenge that comes in with supporting all that flexibility.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm sure our audience has lots more questions, and Jeff and the Phil information on how to reach us is in the chat. So thank you both for this discussion, and we'll hand it back over to Sue.
Great. I think there is, I'm hoping we have, I think Jean, who you mentioned earlier, must be a colleague of yours, want to mention the storytelling aspect of this. Yeah, so if you want to speak to that? Just
Yeah, for sure. And so one of the ways to think about, once you've built out a map within Kumu, we have a feature called presentations, which allows you to do a bit of a scripted unfolding. And so just think of that as going one step beyond the typical map that I showed you here, where you can actually show piece by piece and you can include additional content. And so it's a way to help reduce the chance of people being overwhelmed by seeing this entire map at once. You can really start them in a corner and unfold, or start them in one loop and unfold the map from there. And so it ends up being a really helpful way, especially when you're getting more towards how do you share what you build in Kumu with people who weren't involved in actually building it, right? You really want to try to manage that overwhelm that's so easy to happen with some of these larger maps.
That's great. I think there was another question too, just about costs. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yep. Yeah. So cost-wise, the basic way to think about Kumu is any work that you're doing in public, meaning that anyone can view, but you choose who can edit, is completely free. So it's our way of kind of trying to give back. If you need to keep the map private and that you choose who can view, it's either $9 per month for a private project or $20 per month for a private project, depending if you're on which plan you're on with us. Again, part of like, those are not the discounted prices, so you get additional discount from there with the 20% off. Sticky Studio is free for unlimited number of boards. Where it just moves into a paid model is if you need to limit who can access those boards. So by default, the sharing link is turned on. Anyone you send that to can see it, but otherwise free of charge. And if you do pay, it's $9 per month. So trying to keep that really accessible. And then Weavr is $29 per month for community. So there's no cap on how many people use it. It's not a per user. It's just $29 for the whole community per month.
Great. Does the Weavr allow for uploading of documents or videos or any of that?
Yeah, so what you can do there, you can certainly import data to bootstrap a community. So to get it started, and say you have data already, we can help get that in there. When you're creating the projects, you saw a reference in my profile, there's different projects there and there's organizations. Those communities can have updates saved in them. So any project can have an update, and that can be like a text update. It can be a link out. It doesn't do the actual file, like document repository. So if you're trying to do that, you're usually using a different tool. You're using Box, Dropbox, Google Drive, something else, and then providing links out to those.
That makes sense.
But images and things like that, basic things like that, can be shared within the messaging platform, but there's not any sort of like folder hierarchy or organization baked into it.
Okay. Great. Well, it was fun because I know Aubrey in Hawaii. And so I'm like, hey, I'm connected to you. And then Rob, I know, so it's like, we could do our own little networking kind of.
That's often, that's one other question that does come up with Weavr, is the extent to which, right? I think there's value in having the isolated networks, especially because people want to own their own data and don't want to worry about these privacy concerns. But that often comes up like, hey, I want to link multiple communities together. And that's not possible right now. If you needed to do that, you kind of do that in a separate workaround. Each of those communities really are discrete and don't have a view into any others on the platform.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is amazing. I mean, I thought I knew some of what it can do, but it's just amazing. And I think thanks for sharing, and costs are very reasonable, right? Particularly if we're able to offer a discount. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time and am most grateful for you all. And thank you. Thanks so much.